On Friday, May 17th, the Karen Read trial continued with day 14 of testimony continuing on with the prosecution's case in chief. On day 14, the jury heard from just two witnesses, Matthew McCabe and Jennifer McCabe. And I have to say, this was the first day that the prosecution was really able to earnestly put some points on the board in this trial, particularly with the testimony of Jennifer McCabe. But will it be enough to start to convince the jury of Karen Read's guilt? Or have the previous 3 weeks, and especially the testimony of her husband Matthew right before she took the stand, made it harder for the jury to buy what she is saying on direct examination? Will cross-examination deconstruct her testimony like it has for pretty much every prosecution witness so far? We'll go through it, and in the end, I want to hear what you think in the comments below. Let's get into it. Okay, so really quick, my apologies that I am not in my usual office for this recap. I know how much people love seeing our sweet fur buddies in these recaps and in these live streams, and I really wish that we could have them with us here too. But for a bit of time, I'm going to be streaming and recapping from some different places on the road as I head back to eventually see some family for a bit. So please do bear with me as the environment around me kind of changes gradually throughout these recaps and streams. On to day 14, which picked back up with the remainder of Matthew McCabe's direct examination. Okay, so to back up just a second, at the end of day 13, the direct examination of Matthew McCabe was cut off, so it picked up again on day 14. As a reminder, most of his testimony overlapped with the testimony of a lot of other people about going to the Waterfall Bar and Grill, then 34 Fairview Road, and seeing a quote-unquote dark SUV roll up outside the house. But his testimony was primarily helpful to add the detail about some abnormal V-shaped tire tracks in the snow. So this seemed to be the first hint by the prosecution to try to introduce their theory as to what they say happened to John O'Keefe that night. But based upon how every single witness testimony has gone so far, I knew not to count out the defense just yet before they've had a chance to cross-examine. But before we get into the cross-examination there, first let's talk about the remainder of the direct examination, which picked up on how he woke up on the morning of January 29th, 2022. Matt McCabe said that he and his wife received a phone call where someone was screaming, "Jen, Jen, Jen," over and over again. In fact, he said that it was so loud and so disorienting that he testified that in the morning fog, he actually thought that someone was in the room with them yelling at his wife. Anyway, eventually he realized that this was Karen who had called Jen and was screaming over the phone about how John hadn't made it back that night. Around 30 minutes later, Karen was in their driveway and screaming more hysterically about John going missing. At some point, Carrie Roberts also arrived and the three women decided to go out together. And here's where we started to see a little bit of a different side of Matt McCabe that we hadn't really seen on day 13, or at least that I personally hadn't detected. There were a couple comments that Matt made about this part of the timeline that may or may not rub the jury the wrong way. Karen was clearly in hysterics, according to the testimony, and Matt said that he basically snapped at her to shut up or she would wake up the whole neighborhood. And in explaining why he wouldn't go out with the ladies to look for him, he kind of scoffed like, "Why would I go out looking for him in a winter storm like this? That's ridiculous." Granted, he did contextualize that, saying that he figured that the most likely situation was that John was passed out on someone's couch waiting out the storm. At the same time, however, he did make sure to say that he was concerned about his wife going out into the storm in Karen's car because Karen had told him over the phone that she had a cracked taillight on the car. And all of that said, by the end of day 14, we got a pretty good picture of what kinds of things Karen was repeating, screaming really over and over again. And there was nothing in either Matt's or Jen's testimony later that struck me as Karen being disingenuous about her panic and hysteria. And that is going to become pretty important by the end of this video. So I have to wonder how the jury takes a couple comments like that, where Matt seems a little cold and callous in the face of a woman panicking over her missing boyfriend when a big winter storm is in the process of happening. Eventually, however, he did testify that when he did learn what actually happened to John, he said he went over to 34 Fairview Road and went to be with Jen and his brother-in-law and sister-in-law, Nicole and Brian Albert. He then talked about a couple of interviews that he had with the police, one with Officer Lank at 34 Fairview Road, and the other one was with Trooper Michael Proctor and Trooper Buchanan back at the McCabe house. Okay, so that's all for the direct examination. By the time we got to the cross-examination, there were some occasional tendencies that Matt McCabe has shown on the stand that, like I said, came across to me as a little cold and callous in the context of a case where someone has died. It seemed to be a somewhat different look than his first day testifying, when he actually seemed to come across pretty well. But his characteristics seemed to change even more on cross-examination as he was grilled by David Yannetti. And how you conclude about that may depend on whether you're turned off by the defense at this point, or if you've basically enjoyed the ride that the defense has provided on each cross-examination so far. Now, as I've said many times in this trial, we have no idea what the jury is actually thinking. We can only go with how we personally are reacting to these things, and that may or may not be accurate in applying that to the jury. But on cross-examination, Matt McCabe would smile a lot, and at times even laughed seemingly at the questions being asked of him. And this could totally be just the case of someone who laughs when he's nervous. Testifying as a witness is a very stressful experience, and this could very well be a stress response. Or, on the other hand, it could be a negative personality trait. To some, it looked like someone who was nervous, but to others, it looked like someone who had a sense of superiority and dismissiveness. And this could hurt the prosecution if the jury feels like he's kind of just a bad guy, because it may prevent them from trusting his testimony. And with the jury having very limited information on the lore that surrounded this case about the social media frenzy and the experiences of the witnesses, you have to wonder what they are thinking about his reactions as they get newly acquainted with him. Anyway, on cross-examination, Yannetti went over basically 6 subjects. The first subject was how much alcohol Karen had to drink that night. Again, this is very important for the DUI charge against Karen in this case. And on cross-examination, Matt McCabe agreed that although Karen was drinking clear liquid from a glass, he couldn't really be sure what it was. He also agreed that both John and Karen weren't drinking all that much when at the Waterfall. And he agreed that they both only got there at about 11 p.m. and the Waterfall closed around midnight, and that the Waterfall is actually very strict about serving drinks after last call. And although Matthew fought with Yannetti about whether Karen was intoxicated, Yannetti brought in Matt's testimony from a hearing on April 26, 2022, where Matt said that Karen was not in fact intoxicated while at the Waterfall. So here we have yet another witness from the prosecution who appears to be supporting the argument that Karen wasn't actually drunk that night when she got behind the wheel. And so here we are, 38 witnesses in, and I am still waiting for a scintilla of evidence, a chinchilla of evidence, if you will, on the DUI charge. Anyway, the second subject on cross-examination addressed Matt's testimony on the position of the dark SUV that he says that he saw. And here we get into a risk that is taken whenever one side on a trial decides to call up a huge number of witnesses to testify. On the one hand, you can get great corroboration if a bunch of people see the same exact thing from different perspectives. But on the other hand, you also run the risk of inconsistencies popping up as people's perception and memory can be slightly different from one another. And there are really 2 different kinds of inconsistencies. There are the ones that you can reasonably explain away, and where we can classify it as basically a distinction without a difference. And then there are the ones that make you question the reliability of the testimony because one version just can't live with another. And here, Matt runs into a pretty big inconsistency when he starts to give more detail about where he says that he saw the dark SUV that night. Now, first, let's talk about what seems to be pretty common across the board among all of the witnesses who say that they saw it. The dark or black SUV was pulled over along the sidewalk to the house with the passenger side facing the house. At first, it was pretty close to the mailbox and essentially next to the driveway. Then it creeped forward a bit, and then it creeped forward a bit more as far as the flagpole and the fire hydrant before it ultimately disappeared. This seems to be agreed upon by everyone, so it doesn't seem like there's much of a question as to whether this SUV was actually at 34 Fairview Road at this time. But here's where Matt starts to run into trouble. First, he testified that the dark SUV was pulled basically right in front of a Jeep that had a snowplow in the front of it. He also somewhat testified to seeing a pickup truck arrive at some point. I say somewhat because he seemed to squirm a bit about where exactly the pickup truck was when it did arrive. When asked in a general way where the pickup truck was, he responded with something like, "Oh, I wasn't focused on it, so I don't really know." But the problem is, he was pretty clear in noticing the Jeep. And basically everyone else who testified to seeing the SUV testified to seeing it parked right in front of not the Jeep, but the pickup truck. Brian Albert Jr. and Julie Nagel both testified to not seeing a Jeep between it and the pickup truck. And all three witnesses sitting inside the pickup truck said that they didn't see a Jeep between them and the SUV. And those people were actually really specific about their testimony. Particularly, they said that the SUV started out like just a few feet away from the pickup truck. And they said that they specifically remembered this because they remembered seeing her taillights or her brake lights on. And those were basically like right in their faces. And they had enough detail in their memory to testify affirmatively that her taillights were all intact at this time. And what's more, all of the individuals inside the pickup truck testified to seeing the light on in the SUV when they passed by to leave, and all of them testified that they saw a woman in the driver's seat. One of them even testified that prior to this, she noticed that there was also a man in the passenger seat and that he was gone when they were on their way out. In contrast, Matt testified that he did not see a light on in the car at any point, so he didn't see anyone inside. And when pressed as to how far he saw the Jeep was from the SUV at the beginning, Matt couldn't seem to give a clear answer. In fact, during cross-examination on this point, it started to become really unclear where he said the SUV was versus where he had previously said it was. And I will say that during this cross-examination, I was previously thinking that Yannetti was struggling to maintain control of the conversation in this part because it just felt so muddy as to like what the questions and answers even were. But as I've been reviewing some of the testimony for this recap, I'm actually wondering if that was maybe a strategy that Yannetti was employing just to muddy up the waters so that the jury just throws up their hands like, I have no idea what this guy saw. Honestly, I don't know. I could go either way on it at this point. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below though. Anyway, the third subject on cross-examination was the abnormal tire tracks that Matt said that he saw in the snow after this point. I said in the day 13 recap that this could be the beginning of the prosecution indicating that this was the time and place that Karen had hit John and left him for dead. But on cross, Yannetti brought up an interesting point where he got Matt to agree that the V-shaped tracks in the snow could be consistent with doing a 3-point turn. And then Yannetti brought in actually the first map that we've seen in this trial and pointed out whether she likely left the house by driving one way or another. And so this would suggest that the defense is arguing that these abnormal tracks are just Karen making a 3-point turn to go home after dropping off John at the house. Matt then agreed that he didn't actually hear any noise to suggest that something had happened. And Yannetti also got him to say that he had a clear view of the front yard and that he did not see a 6'2" man out there on the lawn at any point. Anyway, the fourth subject was the black blob that Julie Nagel had testified to having seen. Similar to Sarah Levinson, Matt McCabe testified that he did not hear anyone identify anything abnormal on their way out. He didn't hear Julie Nagel say anything about a black blob or anything else of substance, really. So this is more inconsistency for Julie Nagel's version of these events, and particularly having to do with that black blob part. Anyway, the fifth subject on cross-examination was a number of texts from Matt to a group chat about seeing Massachusetts state troopers parked at the neighbor's house next door to 34 Fairview Road days after the incident. In the group were Matt, Jen, Brian Albert, and Nicole Albert.
And at some point on February 1st of 2022, you were physically either at or near the Albert home at 34 Fairview in Canton, correct?
I could have been. I don't recall if I was there.
Do you recall watching what investigators were doing in the neighborhood on February 1st?
I do not. If you could show it to me, I could maybe reflect my memory. I do not recall that specific day.
You don't recall monitoring what troopers were doing in the
I was not
neighborhood?
monitoring anything that the troopers were doing. If I had driven down the street, dropping someone off, picking somebody up, and saw the troopers, then I saw the troopers. I was not monitoring anything.
Directing your attention to 1:34 p.m. and 27 seconds. You texted your wife, Brian Albert, and Nicole Albert, quote, "Troopers back out front, but in front of Asian house." Did you not?
If I texted that, you could show it to me.
May I approach you, Mike?
Yes.
Having reviewed that document, is your memory refreshed?
I see that I texted what you said I texted. The troopers were outside of the house, yes.
Right, that's my question. This is a page that contains the group text that you had with Jen McCabe, Brian Albert, and Nicole Albert, correct?
Yes.
And in terms of the question that I asked you, you now acknowledge that you testified troopers back out front, but in front of Asian house, correct?
That's correct.
Mr. McCabe, what is an Asian house?
The next door neighbors to the Alberts were Asian.
So you mean that a family of Asian origin lived next door?
Yes.
They were the next door neighbors to your brother-in-law and sister-in-law?
Correct. They lived, if you come out of Fairview, they lived to the right of the Alberts.
Now, the defense definitely did this for multiple reasons. Number one, this is to introduce the question, why were state troopers back at the house digging up evidence days after Canton PD had closed everything out? This is bringing up more questions about the shaky investigation in this case, and especially where it sounds like it's going to turn out that this is probably when all those taillight pieces were supposedly found. But more than that, it also shows the active interest that the Alberts and the McCabes were possibly taking in this investigation. What that active interest means might depend on how you feel about this case so far, but it does help the defense to remind the jury about these things. But anyway, the final reason why the defense did this was definitely to just make Matt McCabe look bad. For the defense, this really is just icing on the cake that Matt used a racial marker to describe the neighbors, because it really just gives an opening to the defense to make Matt look like a bad person.
Did you know their last name was the Chungs?
I had no idea that. I've never met them. I don't know their last names. I just knew it was an Asian family next door.
And you didn't feel the need to ask their names or try to call them by their names?
I've never met them, sorry.
Objections sustained.
Now, is it racist to describe the next door neighbors as Asian? Some will say it is, others will say that it isn't. And I should remind people that these neighbors were not, in fact, Matt's neighbors, but Brian Albert's neighbors. And to a certain extent, I will say that it is fairly reasonable for someone to say that they don't know their in-laws' neighbors well enough to know them by name. But anytime someone uses race as a signifier, there's always a good chance that people can see that as a reductionist way of dismissing the relevance of those people. And another layer to this is, what are the lived experiences of the jurors? I did hear that some of the jurors are also of Asian descent. I have no idea if that's actually true, but if it's true, it could play a role here. But even with that, I think that it could cut both ways. On the one hand, maybe this makes them look at Matt and feel like they want to dismiss him because they feel like he's just dismissed these neighbors. Or maybe they look at all of this and say, okay, so he called the neighbors Asian. So what? It's not a slur to call people Asian if they are in fact Asian, and there are way worse things that they could have called them, and I in fact have experienced those kinds of things. Either of those is a possibility here. But remember what I said about Matt smiling and laughing on the stand, and the possibility of people seeing Matt as dismissive and having an air of superiority at times while testifying. If jurors were on the fence about whether to accept him as nervous or rude, this part here could have changed that. And as usual, I wish I could have seen the jury to see if anyone did react to that. Anyway, the final subject covered on cross-examination was the biggest bombshell yet, and this was another group text that the defense brought in.
Mr. McCabe, when we broke, I was just about to ask you about the last exchange here. You will agree with me that on February 1st of 2022 at 12:51 and 49 seconds, you texted the group chat to say, ask Chris to ask some questions correct?
Yep, I'm reading it right now. Yes, that's correct.
And who was the Chris you were referring to?
That would be Chris Albert.
Brian's brother, correct?
That is correct.
And then you then texted your wife, Brian Albert, and Nicole Albert, quote, "Tell them the guy never went in the house," correct?
Yeah, that's part of the same text. Yes.
Mr. McCabe, who was the guy that you were referring to? Does he have a name?
That would be John O'Keefe.
When you told the group to tell them the guy never went in the house, that was you talking about how you should all get your stories straight, correct?
No.
You would agree with me that your stories are all straight in terms of the guy never went in the house, correct?
Objection.
Can you answer that?
John never went in the house. It's not a story, it's a fact.
Well, when you said, tell them the guy never went in the house, Brian Albert was on that exchange still, was he not? He was still part of the group text?
Yes, Brian is on the exchange.
And Brian Albert was the one to respond, wasn't he?
Let me switch pages here. 51.
He responded, did he not?
Yes, he did.
And then at that point, you knew Brian Albert was the oldest brother of the Albert family, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
The oldest sibling in that family, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And in his response to your instructions that his younger brother, Chris, should say that John O'Keefe never went in the house, or the guy never went in the house, you would agree with me that he responded with one word, correct?
Yes, he did.
And in response to you saying the guy never went in the house, Brian Albert's response was, exactly, correct?
Yes, that's his response.
All right, we're done here.
Now, there are multiple levels to this. First, there's the fact that this looks an awful lot like a group of witnesses that are getting their story straight. This sounds like Matt is instructing other witnesses on how to talk about their testimony, and it sounds like Brian Albert is agreeing with that instruction. And then, of course, there's that once again, seeming dismissiveness that appeared to have leached out of Matt throughout his testimony. He doesn't refer to John as John or the victim even. Rather, Matt refers to John as the guy, which just feels like such a dismissive and cold and callous way of referring to someone whose life has ended in the midst of whatever happened in the early morning hours of January 29th, 2022. And this contradicts how Matt had talked about John as a neighbor and a friend, and through the friendship of Matt's daughter and John's niece, etc. But taking a step back for a moment, here's the thing about testimony like this. Sometimes it can feel a bit like a tennis match. One side pumps up a witness and they look great on direct examination. Then on cross-examination, something comes out and makes the witness look really bad. Then on redirect, that first attorney gets up and contextualizes the witness's testimony from cross-examination, and the jury realizes, oh, wait a minute, that really wasn't as bad as the other side made it look to be. Okay, disregard. And so when text messages come out on cross-examination like this, it's always a good idea to listen for the redirect to see if there's some missing context. But here, the prosecution got up on redirect, and after the defense painted this picture of the Alberts and the McCabes all acting in conformity with, like, the plan, this is the very first question that Adam Lally asked Matt McCabe.
Mr. McCabe, John O'Keefe never went in the house that night, is that correct?
That's correct.
And
All this does is echo exactly what the defense was saying was happening. This kind of a question doesn't combat those texts. This looks like those texts are playing out in real life, live in front of the jury. Instead of this, a stronger way for Lally to jump into redirect would have been to reframe those texts, to give some other reason why Matt said what he said. What did he really mean when he said, just tell them the guy never went into the house? Why would he say that if the truth was that John, in fact, never went into 34 Fairview Road? There could be other reasons as to why Matthew McCabe texted what he texted, so give us a reason to explain it away. But instead, we were basically left at the end of redirect with the reasoning given by the defense, and now thinking about it over the weekend, that's the side that has stuck. Okay, so that was all Matt McCabe. Then the rest of the day was the direct examination of Jennifer McCabe. And before I get into the details on this one, I just have to say up front that based on her direct examination, she should have been the very first witness out of the gate. I really don't understand why she's the 39th witness in the prosecution's case in chief. Unless the prosecution expects that her cross-examination comes out on Tuesday morning and everything she testified to on direct just absolutely crumbles. This would be basically the only explanation as to why Jen's testimony is stacked so far behind in this trial. But if that's the case, it then brings up another question. What are they doing bringing this case in the first place? The reason I say all of this is because she is apparently the singular witness who can testify to basically everything from the Waterfall Bar and Grill to Carrie Roberts taking John O'Keefe's parents to the hospital where he was declared dead. Jennifer McCabe was at 34 Fairview Road and testified to being one of the last people who communicated with John before he died to give him directions to the house. She was also one of the first people who Karen Reed apparently reached out to when she was hysterically looking for John in the snowstorm after he didn't come home. So if I were prosecuting this case, Jen McCabe would be the main mast of my case, and all of the other witnesses who would testify would be chosen as like this ship that I would build around this mast to fit with her testimony. And she would also be the first person to testify to establish the full story of what happened so that the jurors also end up fitting everyone else's testimony around Jen's narration. But instead, we've had 3 weeks of people testifying to small little pieces of what happened on January 28th and January 29th, and often with contradictions of various sizes. And now her testimony has to fit with everyone else's. And so now that we've finally gotten some evidence on the record through Jen, showing the prosecution's theory as to what actually happened to John O'Keefe on that night, parts of it feel awkward, even though her direct examination was something that I would overall classify as basically a good day for the prosecution. So anyway, on to her actual testimony. Skipping through the fluff at the beginning, because there is always fluff with a Lally direct examination, the main first thing that she testified about was, of course, the Waterfall Bar and Grill. There really was nothing here that was actually any different than what anyone else had testified, especially about what John and Karen were drinking and how much. Interestingly, she does corroborate what Christopher Albert said about seeing Karen walk in sneaking a glass of clear liquid under her coat. So again, every single witness for the prosecution who was at the Waterfall Bar and Grill has testified that Karen Reed drank a clear liquid from a glass and at most assumed that it was vodka. Not a single person could say why they thought it was vodka other than that the liquid was clear. Not a single person has testified that they noticed or suspected that Karen was intoxicated at the waterfall. And in fact, most, if not all, have testified that she affirmatively was not intoxicated when they saw her. So again, based on the evidence that is on the record at this point, there is no evidence to support this DUI charge at this stage in the trial. And again, We're 3 weeks in now. Anyway, when the waterfall was closing and people were leaving, Jennifer apparently received a text from John asking where to. And instead of texting him back, since she said that she was driving, she called him back. She testified that she had 2 phone conversations with him while the 2 couples were in their respective cars, and she was giving him directions to go to 34 Fairview Road. One thing that she mentioned is that she gave John Bella's house as a landmark to use for how to understand getting there. And this is a landmark that comes up again later when Karen, Jen, and Carrie Roberts are in the car looking for John in the morning. Apparently, Bella is a schoolmate of Kaylee, John's niece. And at one point before dating Karen, John apparently dated Bella's mom, Ashley, for a while. When the ladies were later looking for John, someone in the car mentioned that maybe John was at Ashley's house on her couch. This apparently sent Karen off into another panic on top of the overall hysteria that she was already exhibiting. And it sounds to me like this was something that was dropped several times throughout Jen's testimony in order to suggest a motive as to why Karen would kill John. Jealousy. So like I said, the prosecution is putting some points on the board with Jen's testimony. We will see how well it sticks, however, after it's tested on cross-examination. Anyway, back to the timeline here. Jen said that she and Matt arrived at 34 Fairview Road around 12:20 a.m. and did not see Colin Albert there. At that point, she testified that she texted John a few times about getting to the house.
So the next bubble down is a blue bubble, is that correct?
Correct.
Similar to the one before, can you just read as far as that? Well, before I get to that, I'm sorry. So you received that message from Mr. O'Keefe. You call him, have a conversation. He calls you back to a further conversation.
Correct.
And then subsequent to that, could you read the next blue bubble down as far as from whom, what the content is, and what time it is?
So this one is from myself to John, and it says here at 12:27. So at that point, I see a car out front, and I text him here.
You testified to as far as looking out the front storm door, seeing a car, and then you sent the text. That's the text.
Correct.
And Ms. Gilman, if you would scroll down to that. And ma'am, similar, if you could just, who sent it, what's the content, and what is the time?
I sent to John, pull behind me at 12:31.
And what were you referring to when you said pull behind?
So at this point, the car had moved from the prior spot where I originally saw it. So I thought, what is he doing? Why don't they just pull behind me in the, in the driveway?
And you just scroll down. And again, with this bubble, if you could read out.
From me to John saying hello, and it was at 12:40.
And at this point in time, as far as, let me ask you this way. When you're sending these text messages over these periodic time periods, what, if anything, are you doing sort of in between?
So I originally went to the front door, saw the car, texted them, then texted John. Then I went back, kind of sat at the table, just either threw my phone probably in my back pocket. And then a couple minutes later, I got up again and saw that the car had moved. So I had sent the pull behind me. And then a few minutes later, I went back to the window, to the front door, I'm sorry.
And when you went back to the front door, what, if anything, did you see of that?
So at this specific point at 12:40, when I say hello, I cannot be certain whether they were still out front or if they had left.
And from any of these text messages that you sent, what, if any, response did you receive from Mr. O'Keefe after the where to?
None.
Ms. Gilman, if you could, to the next bubble. And similar to the prior ones that you just read.
Sure. Jen to John, where are you? And that was at 12:42.
So as you can tell, Jen also testified to actually seeing the SUV out front, which was what guided these texts that she sent to John. And she also said that she saw no one get out of the SUV at any point, and she testified that John O'Keefe never walked into 34 Fairview Road. Now again, if she had been the first one to testify in this trial, her testimony could have been the one that all the others get compared to. But especially going right after Matt McCabe's cross-examination with that whole group text instructing other people seemingly to testify in a particular way, I personally now question every single witness who was in that texting thread. Are they testifying that he never went into the house because he actually never went into the house? Or are they testifying that way because the entire family has somehow agreed that that was the story that they were going with? To be clear, I'm still not convinced that there was a conspiracy to frame Karen Read for John O'Keefe's death. So far, I have not seen enough evidence to support that conclusion as far as I can see. But the more that stuff like that comes out, the more that can change. And in turn, the less that I trust these witnesses when there's a bit of a toss-up as to who we should trust. Anyway, apparently when John and Karen never came inside to 34 Fairview Road, Jen testified that she figured that they had just decided to go home. Maybe they got into an argument, maybe John got a call from Kaylee and she didn't want to be home alone or something along those lines. To me, this actually does sound reasonable. I've seen some questioning as to why Jen didn't call at that point as opposed to text, but to me, that distinction is a little bit of a nothing burger. Anyway, she then testified that around 1:45 a.m. she left with Matt and they drove Sarah Levinson and Julie Nagel home. After getting home, she said that she basically immediately went to bed. Then, like Matt testified, Jen said that she woke up to a phone call at 4:53 a.m. She said it was Kaylee, John's niece, and that Karen was in the background screaming.
And even in that initial call when you're speaking to Kaylee, what, if anything, do you hear sort of in the background when you're talking?
Karen screaming.
And could you hear what she was screaming?
She was just screaming, Jen, Jen, Jen!
Fairly loudly, is that correct?
Extremely.
Now, at some point, does the defendant get on the phone with you?
She does.
And what, if any, conversation do you have with her at that point?
She proceeds to scream my name multiple times, and she tells me that John didn't come home, they got into a fight, and that she left him at the waterfall.
And how do you respond to that?
I had just woken up. I was confused. I didn't know what she was talking about. I was like, what are you talking about? And then she, told me that they had gotten into a fight and she left him there and now where is he? And she was just kept screaming my name over and over. And so then I remembered that Chris Albert had still been at the bar. So I thought, well, maybe John walked home with Chris because Chris lives close to the waterfall.
And so, at some point, that conversation ended and you recall how that ended?
I told her that I was going to call Julie and see if John had ended up with Chris.
And so, you hang up with her, and then what did you do then?
I called Julie Albert.
And did Julie pick up the phone?
She did not.
And as you were calling Julie, did you have any conversation with your husband, Matt, around that time?
Yes. He, had kind of shot up out of bed when Karen had called. When Kaylee had called because Karen was screaming. And then he was, what's going on? And I said, well, I'm calling Julie because Karen, they got into a fight and I was trying to explain it to him. And he said, what are you talking about? We saw them outside of your sister's house. And at that point, I hung up.
And when you hung up, Julie had not answered yet, is that correct?
Correct.
Now, as far as Miss Reed, is that someone who had your phone number? Did you have her plugged into your phone as a contact before that date of January 29th?
No.
So never had any kind of conversation with her over the phone as far as a text or a phone call or anything? You didn't even have her information?
Correct.
And so after hanging up while calling Julie, what, if anything, did you do then?
And then I'm not sure if I called Kaylee back or if Kaylee called me back.
But at some point you get back in touch with Kaylee, or at least her phone, correct?
Yes, I get Karen. I get in touch with Karen again, and I say, Karen, we saw you outside of my sister's.
And what was her response to that?
She told me that she didn't remember going there, and then she started yelling, Jen, Jen, and then she was saying, did I hit him? Could I have hit him? And then she proceeded to say that she had a cracked taillight.
And this is while you're still in your home and you're in your bedroom, correct?
Correct.
And what was your response to that?
I thought she was honestly like just talking crazy. And then she said, oh my God, I left him there. Like she was extremely irrational. She said that it told me again that they had gotten into a fight. So now she was just kind of all over the place, just screaming. She was very hard to understand. So my brain started going, okay, well, if she left him there, where could he be? Who could he be with?
And as you're going through that sort of process, what did you do next?
So then earlier in the night, there was another individual who we had been in contact with, or my husband had been talking to, and he had mentioned that he was gonna meet up with John at Waterfall as well, but he never ended up coming. I knew he was at a house close to Fairview, so I thought, well, maybe if they got into a fight, like John might have texted this individual, and maybe he just ended up on his couch.
Who was that individual?
Tom Beatty.
And who was Tom Beatty in relation to, how did you know him?
He has 2 daughters that are the same age as my daughters.
So then Jen says that she goes downstairs to make a cup of coffee and she hears someone outside screaming. It's Karen, and she's apparently screaming, Jen, Jen, Jen again, this time outside the McCabe's house.
Was opening your door, hearing screaming from out front, was that something that surprised you?
Yes.
And when you hear the screaming, if you could just explain to the jury, how loud was the screaming that you were hearing?
Very loud.
And what, if anything, was she saying at this point?
It was more of the, Jen, Jen, did I hit him? And then she would yell, did I hit him? Could I have hit him? And then she was yelling, we have to go to Fairview.
And in addition to Miss Reed, what, if anything, else did you see when you opened up the door?
Just,
Ask in a better way. Did
yeah.
you see a vehicle?
Yes,
And where was the vehicle and what did the vehicle look like?
it was in my driveway. I believe the driver door was left open.
And what kind of vehicle was it?
A black Lexus.
Consistent with what you had seen outside of Fairview the night or earlier in the morning.
Yes.
And so as she's coming up your walk towards your front door,
Running, yes.
and then what, if any, conversation did you have with her there in reference to that?
I just said, Karen, Karen, I was trying to calm her down. Matt came, I believe, and was yelling down that she was going to wake up the neighborhood. And then she was yelling that we had to go to Fairview. So I told Matt that I was going to go with Karen.
Initially, before that, what were your plans as far as going to look for John before Miss Reed showed up at your house?
My husband and I were going to go to Tom Beatty's.
Now, once you decide that now you're going with Miss Reed, the defendant, where did the two of you go?
So as we walked out, there was a car pulled up and then a plow.
Recognize the car that pulled up?
No.
And I'm sorry, I interrupted. So the car pulls up and then the plow, and then what happened?
So in the car was Kerry Roberts, and so she kind of rolled down the window and was like, Karen, what are you doing? And then the plow was behind her. So Kerry pulled up, and I believe I told Karen that I was going to drive her car because I didn't want her driving because she was hysterical. So we got in her car, and then Kerry Roberts called Karen. And then Karen was screaming and, saying that she had cracked her taillight. We need to go to Fairview. Could I have hit him? Did I hit him? And then she would just scream our names. Kerry was telling her to shut up. that we needed to just go back to John's and we'll drive in one car and let's go to John's. Maybe he's there and he's passed out and you didn't see him.
Okay, so something to note here. I know that we've been talking about a lot of the points that the defense has been scoring throughout this trial. These points right here are being scored by the prosecution. The series of comments that Karen is making are, did I hit him? Could I have hit him? I have a cracked taillight. We need to go to Fairview. And we should take a step back to think about the fact that it is reasonable for a juror to look at that and say, if Karen doesn't know where he is, why is she so insistent to go to Fairview? And what's making her think that it's possible that she hit him? Like, where is that information coming from? And I will say that this is the part of the trial that the defense really has to contend with the most. If this sounds like an admission to the jury, it could be game over for the defense. And going into this trial, I know that a lot of people have been saying that these comments were essentially Karen trying to rationalize an irrational situation, as opposed to giving an admission. But on the other hand, that could also be a very convenient excuse for a damning admission. So I admit, going into this case, I was pretty skeptical of that explanation because it is very convenient. However, at this point in the trial, I think that there's been so much testimony about what Karen Reed said and to whom, and I think that the prosecution may now have a problem with too much testimony. Hear me out for a minute. Early on, this question of what did Karen say? It seemed like what we were trying to get at was, did Karen say this or did Karen say that? But now it actually sounds to me like Karen said all of it. But that doesn't necessarily mean a win for the prosecution on this point. And that's because in order for the jury to think that this is an admission, they have to conclude that there is meaning ascribed to Karen's comments. And the prosecution's problem now is Karen looks like she's completely lost her mind. For example, Jen testified that Karen said that she left John at the waterfall after an argument and that she had no memory of taking John to 34 Fairview Road in the first place. And yet, how many people saw her or her SUV there at 34 Fairview? Jen testifies a number of times that throughout the morning, Karen's screaming all kinds of things that don't make sense. And in between, she's just sitting in the car screaming Jen and Carrie to the other ladies who are sitting right there next to her. This is a woman who, according to all of the prosecution's witnesses' testimony so far who saw her around this time, appears to be having a complete mental breakdown and is even, at least at times, completely dissociated from reality. She's freaking out about, well, maybe John is on Christopher Albert's couch or Bella's mom's couch or any number of places. She's not walking places, she's running places. This is pretty erratic behavior as it's being described by these witnesses. And Jen herself testified in one of those clips earlier in this video that Karen wasn't making any sense and was in complete hysterics. So for a statement to be an admission, the jury's going to need to think that it comes from some kind of a self-recognition of guilt. But can we reliably say that that's present here? Let me know your thoughts in the comments because I really want to know how people are reacting to this testimony. Anyway, then they apparently went to John's house, and of course, he wasn't there. Now, at John's house, Jen also testifies that Karen showed her and Carrie the cracked taillight immediately when they got to the house. Although, oddly enough, the prosecution also then shows surveillance footage of them getting out of the car at John's house, and it looks like they all go straight into the house without even stopping at the taillight. So I do wonder if that's an inconsistency that's also going to be picked up by the defense.
The three of you get out of your respective vehicles. What happened?
Karen brings us to the back of the car and says, look, see, I have a cracked taillight.
And where on the vehicle was she directing yourself and Miss Roberts' attention?
The back right.
So the passenger side, rear part of the vehicle.
Yes.
And when you looked at that area of the vehicle, what could you see at that?
I saw that there were missing pieces, but there was also snow covering it. And Karen was screaming, look, look, and then Kerry was screaming back at her. It was very chaotic, so I didn't stare in depth, but what I can tell you is I saw missing pieces from the taillight.
Anyway, after John's house, they eventually drive over to 34 Fairview Road. I'm skipping over some details here because this is already a really long recap, but it's actually worth watching her whole direct examination. So if you want to see more on it, go ahead and watch it from one of the links in the description below. Anyway, so they're driving around and Jen testifies that Karen suddenly sees John in the snow at 34 Fairview Road.
As you approach that area where trees and the flagpole and the fire hydrant were, what, if anything, happens then?
We drive past the flagpole area, and all of a sudden, Karen starts screaming, there he is, and she's banging to get out.
And banging on the door in the back seat?
Yes.
And at the time that she's saying this, were you able to see anything outside of the vehicle?
I saw nothing.
And what, if anything, when she's banging and kicking the or banging on the door, what did Miss Roberts do?
Miss Roberts unlocked the door. Karen got out. Miss Roberts looked at me and said something like, she's crazy or she's batshit crazy, something like that.
And when the defendant gets out of the vehicle, where is it that she goes?
She just runs
And runs with?
straight to John.
And again, when she's running, at this point in time, can you see what she's running toward or where she's going or anything that she's talking about seeing?
I was on the passenger side, so as I got out, she was already at John.
So she gets out and essentially makes a beeline over to where John was,
Correct.
and you're getting out of the passenger side, and by the time you come around the car, she's already there.
Yes.
And when she gets over there, what, if anything, could you see at that point?
She straddles John and she lifts up his shirt, and then she lifted up her shirt and went to lay on him. And Miss Roberts went over and she was removing the snow from his face.
Karen ends up getting blood all over her from attempting CPR on John, and eventually first responders arrive.
And then what happened then?
More officers began to arrive. Miss Reed just continued to run around screaming. As more officers and EMT arrived, they asked what happened. One EMT asked, one EMT had asked, his name, his age, things like that. If she knew what happened, Miss Reed stated that she hit him. Besides running around saying, I hit him, did I hit him, could I have done this? Is he dead? Is he dead? At one point, one of the police officers put Miss Reed in the back of her cruiser, and he asked for myself to go over with her, and Carrie came over with us as well.
I'd like to just take you back to when the paramedic is asking for information, biographical information, things like that. You indicated that the defendant said, I hit him, is that correct?
Yes,
Is that something that she said once or more than once?
3 times. I hit him, I hit him, I hit him.
Now, before you had made reference to statements she made with sort of qualifiers or questions as far as could I have hit him or did I hit him? Is that what she said at that time when she was speaking to the paramedic?
No, she was earlier, it was could I, did I. When she spoke to the paramedic, it was crystal clear. I hit him.
Now, one of the officers takes her over to the back of a cruiser, is that right?
Yes,
And you were over in that area as well?
yes.
And who, if anyone else, was over in that area?
Miss Roberts.
And while you were over in that area, what was going on over there?
We were in the back of the police cruiser. Karen was sitting in there. I kind of scooched myself in. Miss Roberts came over. Karen grabbed our hands. She asked us to pray. She looked at her hands and she had blood. She asked us if she could have gotten her period. We told her no, that was John's blood. Then she said, what if he's dead? Promise me you'll take care of the kids. Someone's going to take care of the kids. Then we prayed. Then at the end, they were moving John, and at that point, Karen told Kerry, go over, look, is he dead? Is he dead? Is he dead? Over and over. And Kerry said, I'll go over and check on him. And she was yelling, are they working on him? And then at that point, she grabbed my hands and she said, Google hypothermia, Google how long it takes to die in the cold. And so I had my phone out and it was cold and my hands were frozen and I have MS, and I took my phone out while she was screaming and shaking my arm, and I attempted to Google how long does it take to die in the cold.
And when you conducted that search, that was at the defendant's request on scene sometime after 6 a.m. on that day, correct?
Yes.
Now, another thing that Jen testified about was that she actually spoke to something that I've been hammering on about over the last 3 weeks, and that is the snow levels both under and over John at the time that he was found. Remember, the first responders testified that there was about 6 inches of snow on the ground and none of it was on top of John. And to me, that suggested that John ended up in that spot much more recently, because it had been snowing a lot since the time that the prosecution alleges that Karen hit him. So thinking about the prosecution's theory, this lack of snow that was on top of him was a contradiction that needed to be explained by the prosecution. And so Jen's testimony suggests that there was in fact snow also on top of John when they found him, and that they had to move it off of him in order to try to revive him. Okay, so we finally have an explanation from the prosecution, and this can change the timeline on when John likely was placed in that spot or ended up in that spot. And I want to know from you, what do you think? Do you buy Jen's explanation here? Let us know in the comments down below. Anyway, after this, Jen testifies that she tried calling Brian and Nicole Albert about what was going on, but that they didn't pick up. So eventually she goes into the house to wake them up and tell them that John had died. And eventually Officer Lank arrived to interview Brian, Nicole, and Jen. Later, Julie Albert came by and gave Jen Officer Lank's phone number. And Jen testified that after a few hours of being able to sit and think about what had happened that morning, she said that she slowly pieced together everything. And she said she decided to call Officer Lank to tell him about Karen's statements that morning, saying, I hit him, and told Officer Lank that she thought that Karen Reed did in fact kill John O'Keefe. Later on, she was also interviewed by Trooper Michael Proctor and Trooper Yuri Buchanek at her house. And that was about it for day 14. I know this was a really long recap, but there was a lot of important stuff to cover here. I do think that there is a lot here that the defense needs to address concerning especially Karen Reed's statements. I know I don't have much insider information, as so many other people do with this case who have been familiar with it for a very long time, but so far from what the jury has heard from Jennifer McCabe, I think she honestly is the best witness that the Commonwealth has put on yet. But that, of course, can change on cross-examination, as we've seen so many times with other witnesses throughout this trial so far. And on Tuesday morning, I expect to see an intense cross-examination by Alan Jackson going over all of these points. So, who will come out on top at the end of Jen's cross? Time will tell. And with that, I really want to know what you think. Did you find Jen's testimony credible on direct examination? Do Karen's statements sound like admissions? Or do they sound like psychobabble from someone who's in the grips of a complete and utter mental breakdown? Let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this, or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more daily coverage of this trial, both in daily recaps and in the gavel to gavel live streams, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is out. See you on day 15.